You install an EV charging station. Cars pull in, plug in, the meter runs, and money appears while you do nothing else all day. Now the real number. One of the most prominent charging networks in America went from a $2 billion stock market valuation in 2021 to a $169 million fire sale in 2023, then to zero. Here is what this actually costs. Start with the hardware. A single DC fast charger costs $50,000 to $200,000 per unit once installation is included, and a site with heavy electrical work can push past $350,000 per port. Electrical infrastructure alone, trenching, conduit, and panel work, accounts for 30 to 60% of total project cost when the site needs real upgrades, which most do, since few commercial properties already have the electrical service a fast charger requires. A modest 4-port fast charging station, the size McKinsey used in its own profitability modeling, realistically runs $500,000 to $1.5 million all in, once utility interconnection work is included. Federal NYSE funding can cover up to 80% of that cost, but only for projects that clear a lengthy state approval process. And that funding, as you'll see, is not something you can bank on with certainty even after approval. Add permitting, utility interconnection application fees, and a transformer upgrade if the site's existing electrical service can't handle the new load. A step that alone can cost tens of thousands of dollars and take months to schedule with the local utility. And a realistic first-day number for a serious station lands north of $750,000 before a single car has ever charged. Demand charges are the line item nobody budgets for correctly, largely because they don't behave like a normal utility bill. Utilities bill commercial customers not just for total electricity consumed, but for the single highest spike in power draw during the entire billing period. And for a DC fast charging site, that demand charge can account for nearly 74% of the entire monthly electric bill, according to a NYSE-published utility rate study, meaning the majority of the electric bill is set by one bad 15-minute window, not by how much electricity actually got sold that month. Network and software fees for payment processing, uptime monitoring, and remote diagnostics run $50 to $200 per port monthly. Maintenance contracts, insurance for high-voltage equipment, and land lease or rent stack on top. McKinsey's own model of a hypothetical 4-charger 150-kilowatt station in California put total annual operating expenses, electricity, demand charges, and site costs combined, at $220,000 to $250,000 a year. That's before financing costs on the entry investment from Section 1, and before a single dollar of revenue has been counted. Every one of these costs accrues whether the chargers see 10 cars a day or none at all. Now the money side. At a realistic 15% utilization rate, about 7 30-minute charging sessions a day, which McKinsey treats as a solidly performing station, that same 4-charger site generates $265,000 to $285,000 a year in revenue at a typical rate of 45 cents per kilowatt hour. Subtract the $220,000 to $250,000 in annual operating costs from Section 2, and the operating margin before any capital cost is somewhere between $15,000 and $65,000 a year, on a facility that costs $750,000 or more to build. Amortize that entry cost over even a generous 10-year hardware life, and the profit mostly evaporates into depreciation. This is McKinsey's optimistic case, built around a well-sited station with steady traffic. Most stations in the U.S. today don't hit 15% utilization at all, which means most of the industry is operating well below even this thin baseline. That thin margin assumes stable utility rates and steady access to the subsidy that helped pay for the site in the first place. Neither assumption has held up. The external variable is federal subsidy policy, and it has already flipped twice in a single year, a level of volatility no station operator's original underwriting model accounted for. NYSE, the $5 billion federal program funding up to 80% of new fast-charging projects, had all 50 states approved and $2.4 billion allocated by late 2024 after years of state-level planning and contracting that operators reasonably treated as settled. On February 11, 2025, the Federal Highway Administration froze the program indefinitely, suspending between $885 million and $1.5 billion in pending funding and forcing at least 6 states to pause active construction contracts mid-build. Operators already under construction, who had underwritten their projects assuming that 80% reimbursement, were left holding the other 20% alone, with no completion date and no way to know if the rest was ever coming. In June 2025, a federal judge ruled the freeze unlawful and ordered roughly $875 million released. In August 2025, the administration issued revised guidance reopening the program under new terms. 5 months of frozen federal capital, resolved only through litigation, for a program every operator's cash flow model had treated as a stable, bankable input. To see what happens when that kind of instability meets a business model that was already thin, look at the company that was once the most talked about name in EV charging. Volta Industries was founded in 2010 and built its business on a distinctive idea: free charging for drivers, funded entirely by digital advertising, displayed on screens built into the chargers themselves, installed at high-traffic retail locations, including Walgreens. By 2021, the model had enough investor enthusiasm behind it to list on the New York Stock Exchange at a $2 billion valuation, with a footprint of more than 3,000 charge points across 31 states, and a pipeline of 3,400 more in development. The advertising revenue never came close to covering the cost of the electricity and infrastructure it was subsidizing for every free session. By mid-2023, Volta was facing bankruptcy outright. Shell acquired the company in an all-cash deal for approximately $169 million, a roughly 92% collapse from its NYSE valuation 2 years earlier, and by industry accounts, effectively a fire sale rather than a strategic acquisition. The losses didn't stop under new ownership, with a much deeper balance sheet behind them. By late 2024, the Volta business was still losing an estimated $140 million a year and missing its own internal sales forecasts. Shell tried to sell the unit in 2025, failed to find a buyer willing to take it on, and in August 2025 announced it would dismantle the entire network. More than 2,000 charging stations shut down, its remaining 190 employees laid off, operations wound down entirely by the end of the year. This was not a hardware failure or a bad brand. Volta's chargers worked. The advertising subsidized free charging model simply could never outrun the demand charges and low utilization sitting underneath it. The exact structural math in sections 2 and 3, at a much larger scale. Here's a cost that never appears in a clean revenue projection. A single session can retroactively cost more than it earns by pushing the site into a higher demand charge tier. A Nevada utility rate study found that a 50-kilowatt charger built under a small commercial rate class, with no demand charge at all, cost under $15 per charging session, even in a low-use scenario. But once that same site's demand crossed a 98-kilowatt threshold, the kind of spike a single 150-kilowatt fast charger easily produces, its service classification shifted to a large commercial rate that included a full demand charge, and the cost per session in that same low-use scenario jumped to nearly $600. Picture the transaction. A driver plugs into a 150-kilowatt charger, takes a 20-minute fast charge, and pays the station roughly $25 for the electricity delivered. On the receipt, in the moment, that looks like a clean, profitable transaction. Money in, electricity out, nothing unusual. But if that single session happened to be the peak demand event for the site's entire billing month, the resulting demand charge, spread across a handful of other sessions that month, can retroactively cost the operator far more than the $25 that session brought in. The invoice that actually determines whether the month was profitable doesn't arrive until weeks after the sale already happened, and by then, there's nothing left to do about it. There's another cost growing faster than any other line item in this business, and it isn't on the utility bill at all. It's the year or more you wait before the utility even lets you open. That cost is utility interconnection delay. Getting a high-power fast-charging site connected to the grid, including any required substation or transformer capacity upgrade, now commonly takes 12 to 36 months, according to industry cost analyses, and that timeline has been getting longer as EV charging and data center projects compete for the same limited slots in already backlogged utility interconnection queues. During that entire window, an operator is carrying land costs, insurance, and financing on hardware that may already be purchased and sitting in a warehouse or bolted to concrete unused, with zero revenue coming in to offset any of it. The meter that's supposed to generate income is, for a year or more, purely an expense. Demand charges alone can represent anywhere from 23 to 85% of a DC fast-charging site's total operating cost, depending on region and utility rate structure, a range wide enough that two nearly identical stations, built a few utility territories apart with the same equipment and the same traffic, can have completely different survival odds before either one plugs in a single car. A long enough interconnection delay, stacked onto financing costs that don't pause, can exhaust an operator's runway before the site ever generates its first dollar. Scale helps in specific ways. A larger network gets bulk pricing on hardware, more leverage to negotiate time-of-use utility rates before breaking ground, and enough capital to justify on-site battery storage systems that shave demand charges by discharging during a car's fast charge spike instead of pulling that spike straight from the grid every time. But demand charges don't pool the way hardware costs do. Every site sits on its own utility meter and its own rate class, so a 100-site network carries 100 separate demand charge exposures rather than one blended, diversified one. Federal subsidy exposure scales the same way. A company with projects underwritten around NYSE funding across a dozen states had a dozen times the exposure to the February 2025 freeze that a single independent station operator did, simply by virtue of having more projects depending on the same policy decision at the same moment. At a certain size, an EV charging network stops being a hardware rollout and becomes a portfolio of hundreds of individual utility negotiations and political funding dependencies, run simultaneously. Optimistic, a 4-port station costs $750,000 to build, with NYSE covering 80% as intended, leaving the operator's actual cash outlay at $150,000. At 15% utilization, the station generates $275,000 in annual revenue against $235,000 in operating costs, for $40,000 in operating profit. Amortizing the operator's $150,000 investment over 10 years adds $15,000 in annual cost. Net profit, roughly $25,000. Modest, but real, on a subsidized build that performed exactly as the pitch deck promised. Realistic, same station, same year. 6 months in, the NYSE disbursement is frozen, echoing the actual February to June 2025 freeze, forcing the operator to bridge finance the remaining reimbursement at commercial loan rates rather than the subsidy they'd budgeted around, an extra $18,000 in interest for the year. A single high-traffic holiday week pushes the site into a higher demand charge tier for that billing cycle, adding an unplanned $12,000, in line with the Nevada rate class example from Section 6. A slow winter quarter, when EVs draw more slowly in cold weather and fewer drivers travel long distances, cuts utilization from 15% to 11% for 3 months, costing roughly $22,000 in lost revenue that quarter alone. Recalculate, net profit of $25,000 becomes a loss of roughly $27,000 on a station that was sited correctly, built on schedule, and operated exactly as planned all year. The difference between those two scenarios is one funding freeze, one demand charge spike, and one slow season. None of these are exotic disasters. All three happen to someone in this industry every year. Industry-wide profitability data shows most public fast-charging stations in the U.S. still don't clear the roughly 15% utilization threshold McKinsey identifies as the profitability floor, and Volta's collapse, from a $2 billion NYSE valuation to complete shutdown in under 5 years, is the highest profile proof that scale and brand recognition alone don't fix the underlying math. The documented cause was never bad site selection skill or weak marketing. It was structural. Demand charges that don't track actual usage, a federal subsidy program subject to reversal by a single administration with the stroke of a pen, and utility interconnection timelines entirely outside any individual operator's control. 5 habits separate the stations still generating real profit from the ones quietly bleeding cash every month. They negotiate time of use or demand charge mitigated rate structures with their utility before breaking ground, not after the first bill arrives and the damage is already done. They pair sites with on-site battery storage to shave peak demand rather than absorbing it raw at full utility rates. They underwrite their financial model, assuming subsidy money, as upside, never as the base case they can't operate without if it's delayed. They select sites with verified dwell time and traffic data instead of speculative locations to actually clear the 15% utilization floor in real-world conditions, and they build the 12 to 36-month interconnection delay directly into their financing structure so debt service doesn't start before the site can earn a single dollar toward paying it back. That meter running while cars line up is sitting on top of the same math that took one of the industry's most prominent networks from a $2 billion valuation to a $169 million fire sale to a complete shutdown in under 5 years, with 2,000 stations dismantled and every employee let go. The real invoice in this business doesn't come from the driver paying at the charger, It comes from the utility company weeks later, in a demand charge line most owners never fully understand until it's already too late, and it's the one number that actually decides whether the month was profitable. Subscribe for the next breakdown in this series.